across the countryside, this deal can't come soon enough. I mean, I was with a group of producers yesterday, and they were asking me, is it done yet? I said, well, not quite. They're meeting later on this month, so I hear or read through the Japanese media. It's, I think we have a great starting point with TPP and what was negotiated in that text. I think our negotiators did a good job considering all the obstacles that they had with time constraints and the sensitivities of agriculture in the Japanese market. I mean, we went from, in the TPP negotiations, from all of agriculture, we're not going to negotiate on it because it's too sensitive, to, well, we have some sacred products, but some we'll have some flexibility. So I think that there was tremendous gain from the TPP, and we would have seen that over the next few years if we had stayed in that agreement and been able to implement it. But I think that's a good starting point. I can't speak on behalf of all of agriculture, but I know some of my colleagues want more and need more given everything that's going on and how their industry has changed. For our pork producers, what we aim is to eliminate all tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. That has always been our starting point and will continue to be for any negotiation. But we also understand that we need to have flexibility and that our producers need something in the near term. So we'll see what that all comes out and how we're able to negotiate that deal. But it's getting harder and harder for our producers to not have an agreement, especially when you see how beneficial the Japanese market has been to our biggest competitors and how well they're doing, and they're essentially just edging us out and pushing us out of that market that we've worked so hard to cultivate over the last few years. I mean, for us specifically on the pork side, after we had major gains in the Uruguay round, we've seen pork exports quadruple. And what I know is that when we are able to level the playing field, when we're able to set regulatory standards in ag, and we're able to just lower those barriers to trade, and we're really able to win as an industry, and particularly on the pork side.
Great, thank you. I think we're probably at a point where we can open it up for some questions from the audience. I certainly got plenty of additional questions, but let's see if there are others that are here in the room.
Hi, Brian Bradley with American Shipper. Like in the U.S., in Japan, the auto market is very prominent. And Mr. Youthis, I was just curious, what makes you think that U.S. cars can compete in that market?
Well, I think the simple answer is you look around the world and all the other markets around the world, we export 250,000 vehicles to Europe. We export 250,000 vehicles to China, 53,000 vehicles a year to Korea, and 2 million in total around the world every year. And why? The one thing that is clear is that Japan is an outlier. It's 7% import penetration. That means Korean cars, Korean cars, European cars, American cars, all have to carve up 7% of the market. That's all they have to participate in. They're limited to that amount. So this is a unique market and a challenging market, but it is one that has, as I said, from an optimistic perspective, the potential for the U.S. to be more active and to carve out more of that marketplace. So I think that addressing all the systemic issues, the regulatory issues, the overhanging of the concern of the use of currency manipulation that could be used at a later date to limit our competitiveness, as well as dealing with the as I mentioned on the regulatory front, both on the existing and future regulations, that would be an important step, because there's a lot of cost associated with having to homologate a vehicle to the unique standards that exist in Japan, for example. And then And then there's also the dealership access and distribution access, which is another area which is very challenging. If you're limited to actually having, if you don't have enough distribution centers, it obviously is a bottleneck for the ability to increase your market share, regardless of whether there's demand for those vehicles or not in the marketplace. So those are some examples of areas that there is potential upside from an agreement.
Do you think, sorry, can I follow up? Do you think there's upside as far as from a consumer preference standpoint and Japanese consumer preferences? Do you think that, U.S. cars will be attractive there to the Japanese consumer?
Well, I think that as every consumer around the world, I don't think the Japanese consumers are that unique compared to other consumers around the world. I think that given the opportunity, they will respond as other markets, other consumers around the world and other markets have responded.
Hi, my name's Richard Baker with Transnational Strategy Group. Charles, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I'm a retired Ford executive, and one of my assignments was executive director of Ford Japan Limited for about 4.5 years. And
I should be putting the questions to you then.
okay, well, here was my experience having been an importer of Ford-built vehicles from the United States and Europe. We struggled with homologation, as you said. Not just the standards and the regulations, but the physical requirements of selling a car in Japan. Size, vehicle, engine capacity, dimensions, a lot of little nitty-gritty details that affect sales of vehicles there. Quality was a huge issue, both perceived and actual. We were not nearly close to what the Japanese the quality of Japanese vehicles, and that still is proven today if you look at standards around the world. Distribution, I'm with you 100%. One of the hardest things we did was to establish a dealer network in Japan. Very expensive, millions of dollars in real estate, and trying to recruit in the United States, it's very easy to recruit dealers. You get the Toyota dealer, he'll take a Ford store, he'll take a Chevy store, they'll do all of this. In Japan, it doesn't work that way because Japanese dealers would not entertain becoming a Ford dealer. And lastly was fuel economy, which I think we're finally starting to address. But I'm a little more pessimistic than you are in terms of the ability of American brands, Ford, GM, Chrysler, being able to grow and expand their penetration in the Japanese market based upon the experience that I've had. And I'd really like to get your insights as to whether you think I'm off base or whether you think the challenge is really much greater than just changing the standards.
Okay, quick answer to that is that I agree with a lot of what you laid out in terms of some of the challenges for U.S. automakers in the Japanese marketplace. But I would say that the quality gap is largely closed, and the fuel economy issue, as you said, is certainly improved dramatically. So I think that we're now we're in a better position now to actually do better in the Japanese market than ever before. But interestingly, you're from Ford, you work with Ford. Ford has actually pulled out of the Japanese auto market. They have basically thrown up their hands and said, it's a better use of our resources is spent in China and in other markets around the world. They basically just said it's just not worth it, given the decades and the millions and millions of dollars that they spent trying to compete in that marketplace. And interestingly, another global automaker, Hyundai Motors, has also exited the marketplace and just said it's just not worth it. So there are, Fiat Chrysler and Jeep brands and Cadillacs and GM product are still being sold in the marketplace, and there's I actually do believe, especially given the innovation lead that I was talking about earlier, there is a upside potential in the future to do even better and do more, and I certainly hope that happens. But you have to be an optimist in this business, so I tend to fall on the side of being optimistic. Otherwise, I think I probably would have left this business a long time ago.
I hate to say it, being an automobile maker in the U.S. and selling cars in Japan is really takes a major optimistic.
All right, let's get a couple more questions in here. There's one here and one from Monica.
Marilee, International Trade Today, also for Charles. Earlier, Maria said she's scared of what's in the auto report, the 232 report. I wanted to get your take on if the United States was to impose tariffs or quotas on Japan or globally, what that would mean for you and the possibility of getting more access abroad.
Well, interestingly, we, the whole industry, from the aftermarket dealership side of the business, the automakers, both foreign and domestic, have all come together in opposition to the 232 tariffs. So we are absolutely 100% in opposition. We think that the retaliation that would happen from that could be devastating to the 20% of the production that we export around the world. So, just flat out, we are in tandem and in cooperation with all those in the industry, and all of us 100% opposed to the imposition of tariffs in the 232 process.
I think Monica, I think to the front up here, there's a question from Monica.
Hi, I'm Monica He with the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. I have a question for Alyssa. Alyssa, you mentioned the government of Japan has cited fiscal pressure as one of the reasons for targeting these biopharmaceutical industry and these pricing and reimbursement policies. Certainly, this is not an issue that the Japanese government is not the only one that's facing some of these discussions. But it is interesting that the innovative biopharmaceutical industry is kind of bearing most of the burden to address the fiscal issue instead of some of the domestic stakeholders that are also under the healthcare budget. And I'm curious if you can maybe explain, if you were to give advice to the U.S. trade negotiators who, are negotiating an agenda for the trade agreement, or to the Japanese government, how would you help kind of provide some advice or guidance on how to address this from that argument's perspective?
Yeah, I think that's quite right. I think from our standpoint, at the end of the day, we want our most innovative therapies to get to patients. That should be a shared objective for the Japanese regulators, for the U.S. businesses, and the USTR. We want those innovative therapies to get to patients in Japan. And if the environment is not right, if the right balance is not set, if the idea is simply to just reduce the prices, cut prices, those innovative therapies may not end up in the market, and that is a loss for everyone involved. So I think the goal is to have USTR sit down. They are going to need to be looking at TPA, as we said earlier. A lot of these issues are hitting right squarely into the things that TPA is directing them to address, and they're going to need to have these conversations with regulators to think through how can we create an environment that will really promote access to medicines for patients. And that's going to require the Japanese government to make some difficult choices, as all governments are making right now with respect to healthcare. But if they're guided by those principles, by basically setting forth, by following the expectations that TPA sets for how we treat our trading partners, and if their goal at the end of the day is to ensure that the innovative therapies get to patients, I think we can find a solution.
Tammy?
Thanks. Alyssa, to continue on that, assuming that we move towards a skinny deal or a mini deal, is there a way that Japan could take advantage of the fact that they have their own very innovative industry to deal with this sort of outside the agreement and try to find a mutually acceptable pricing structure for their own industry as well as ours too, but to do that without having to go through TPA? Is there any kind of an opportunity for a win-win? What advice would you give the Japanese government?
Well, look, as I said before, I am professionally biased in favor of TPA, but I think that, look, any solution is a good solution. Like, we all want to see solutions. I think we want, though, to make sure that the solutions are durable. And so whatever solutions we find, Charles alluded to this before, you don't want to have new problems cropping up year after year after year. That just erodes the security and predictability of the marketplace, and it makes it a hard place for you to do business. Japan has been a very positive environment for our industry, but that is changing. And if we don't kind of really reset the ecosystem now, we could find ourselves, I fear, in the situation that the autos folks are finding themselves in. And it could just be a really, really challenging environment for a long time to come. So can we create Are there other tools to create that kind of, predictable, reliable environment with, certainty for years to come outside of an FTA? I don't know. I don't know.
Wendy?
Just a quick question. So with my former USTR hat on, this was always like the nightmare when you have three industry people advocating for a longer deal, take the time, get it right, and one advocating for, no, we need a quick deal, we're losing market access, every day we're not in that market. And so, can I throw the question back on the three of you, in that how would you, Alyssa and Charles, respond to the concerns of not only the pork, but the ag industry that feels like it's losing out? But Maria, also to you, listening to the deep and valid concerns from the automotive and pharmaceutical industries, if we move too fast, they might lose out. Interested in your responses?
Well, we're truly the worst, Wendy, because not only do we have we want the hard issues tackled, we want them tackled quickly. So I agree both with Charles and Maria that this has to be. I think we really do understand the challenges that are being faced by industry, and that is because the challenges that we're facing are very real right now for our guys too. These changes are happening in the market right now, so I think we very much understand the need for urgency. And in some respects, some of our issues, TPP has provided something of a framework, and maybe thinks we'll be able to move faster for that reason. But we have these very tough new issues, and they came up after TPP, and we really need to tackle them in a serious way. So
I think we're in a very unique position because usually we're on the side of include agriculture, don't leave us behind. So I think it's very interesting to be in this position where we're advocating for, starting negotiations quickly and getting a deal quickly. We are obviously very pragmatic. We understand the implications of what that could mean, but our farmers are getting hit hard. And I think there's a really good baseline from what we negotiated in TPP. I think what it'll ultimately come down to is we're going to have to compromise. And I'm not talking just about agriculture, I'm talking about everyone is going to have to really figure out what's important for us in the future. Is it to see our competitors win and see our competitors do very well in a market that we know that we could outcompete them, and that's what it'll come down to. We're going to have to make these tough choices and these tough decisions. On the pork side, I think we've been adversely affected, and it's hard to be in these shoes, and it's hard to tell our producers, and it's hard to see on the grain side how they're being affected by tariffs and retaliation, and but I think it'll involve a lot of compromise.
So to be real quick about this, I'm highly sympathetic to the situation that is faced by the pork industry and the ag sector in general. But I think I have to be realistic in terms of the issues that the auto industry faces are ones that have been around since the 70s, the 80s and 90s, and all the way, just decades and decades. And it's very difficult to unravel that very easily and to come up with systemic solutions to that. So it's going to be, and it's in a huge stakes. These are huge, huge stakes, especially for Japan and as well as the U.S. So I guess it's a balance between sympathetic to needing to do something soon, but also realistic that some of these issues are going to be quite a challenge to overcome.
Jim Fothery with GR Group Asia. So the joint statement, which Ambassador LaFleur referred to in the first panel, has actual implications, particularly for the automotive and the ag industry, but maybe even to the biopharmaceutical space. Without getting into too much gory detail, on ag, it clearly sort of laid out the landing zone, unspecific, but it was defined as Japan's existing agreements, and market access would be no more than that. That's interpreted widely as meaning there's maybe some space between TPP and the EU agreement. I don't really want to put you on the spot, but there's an indication there that that's what the Japanese expectations are, and we agreed to that. On autos, it's interesting too, because there's references to market access, which would include, I think, the kind of standards issues that you're talking about, Charles, but also there's very specifically references to increasing Japanese production here. What are the implications for that? And Alyssa, sorry for you. The Japanese kind of wanted to talk about a trade agreement in goods, although it says also services. So now in the Japanese press they say, well, pharmaceutical pricing is a service. Last time I took a pill, it was concrete in my hand, right? So it seems to have some weird implications for your sector too, but particularly ag and autos. What are your thoughts in terms of what seems to be on paper now?
Get it started. I think that we have a good framework. I also understand that ag is a difficult piece to negotiate on our side and on the Japanese side because we have sensitivities on both sides. That being said, I think we have a good starting point with TPP, and we can move forward from there. You know, I'm not at the negotiating table. I just know what we expect out of an agreement, and we're not going to settle for less than TPP. That's absolutely never going to happen on the pork side. But I think that there's definitely wiggle room to see increases in our access.
So Jim, I guess, you know, I was looking at the negotiating objectives in terms of, you know, what the U.S. negotiators are going to be handling. And looking at that, I think if they hit all the main points in the automotive area. In terms of encouraging more investment in the U.S., we've always been open to competition, our industry, and, you know, bring it on. And more investment, great. It's great for communities that have these new greenfield plants pop up, and it creates investment, employment. This is all very, very dynamic and good thing for the industry in its totality. So it's not something we oppose at all, if that's what you're implying.
Yeah, I mean, all I will say on this question of whether, you know, there's somehow some carve out of, you know, pharmaceuticals because it's a service. I mean, in my previous life, spending time with Ambassador Holleyman talking about digital trade, we used to have to debate the finer points of whether digital trade was a good or a service. I think with respect to this sector, the answer is a lot clearer. As you say, you can literally hold it in your hand. I don't think there's a lot of question from the standpoint of a customs official, from the standpoint of just about anybody else about what we're talking about here and whether it falls within the basket of goods. But I would also point out on the statement, another thing that we've taken note of as an industry is the commitment from both the Prime Minister and the President to refrain from taking measures against the spirit of the statement during the pendency of the negotiations. And this is where we would like to see Japan, as a matter of, you know, consistent with that commitment, to refrain from further deterioration in the market because these reforms are happening as we speak.
I just wanted to add one more thought to the question in terms of investment and competition here in the U.S. This is an open market. There's a lot of investment that's being made, and a lot of foreign vehicles sold in the U.S. market as well as domestic sales. It's a very mixed and dynamic market. But you look at Japan, it is not a mixed and dynamic marketplace. And what we're asking for in this whole process is to change that dynamic so that it is like the U.S., where everyone has a chance to compete. There aren't barriers to non-tariff barriers that are put in place that create a situation where the market, as I said, the import market share being 7%. You know, it's just a very small little fraction where it's 45% in the U.S. So, and in most other major developing markets around the world. So, what we're looking for is that, you know, the competitive marketplace that we have here should be also found in Japan.
Let me see if there's one last question from the audience. If not, I will throw out one last question. Ken, I would have a whole series of digital questions had Alyssa not raised that, because let it be known that it's constitutionally impossible for me to discuss an event without talking about digital. But I am struck, particularly in areas like digital, that there are opportunities for the U.S. and Japan to set a high standard that goes even beyond the very nature of the relationship between the U.S. and Japan bilaterally. And so maybe for one sort of kind of quick last conclusion, any thoughts about what really becomes a win-win for Japan and the U.S. by reaching a high standard?
So I agree with you on digital, but yes, broadly, there's a lot of synergies between our economies. We are both highly innovative economies, and I think the points you're alluding to reflect the fact that there are some real opportunities here to set a high standard, not just bilaterally, but in the region. And this is a region that is critical for both of us, and it is not an easy region to operate in. So, I mean, this is a huge opportunity across a broad spectrum of issues, and certainly for us in the IP space, for pricing and reimbursement. I mean, this is a key moment to really set some good, strong principles going forward.
I totally agree with you. I think this is really, it's a good moment to develop regulatory coherence and continue on and make sure that we have good SPS standards and break down those barriers to trade that we face, and really show the world how we can work together and set good standards across the board on agriculture and in other industries. For us, we want to continue to have agreements in the Asia Pacific region, and we need to get this right with Japan. We need to make sure we have a good agreement with high standards. That way we can show that example to other nations that we want to continue to have bilateral agreements with, and say, look, this is what the Japanese and the Americans were able to do, and this is what we expect from the rest of you. So I think that's ultimately what we need to see and make sure, and a big piece of that is having good market access.